welcome our next speaker here, Karen Cadet. I'm actually fortunate to work alongside Karen at the Lean Enterprise Institute, where she serves as Director of Human Resources and Organizational Development. Karen has over 30 years experience leading business training and developing the capability of team members and executives in rapid growth environments. Previously, as Regional Director of Operations at Starbucks Coffee Company, she built a consistent track record of growing the operating performance across a large area of retail stores, along with the continuous improvement capabilities of people. Karen is also the author of a book called Steady Work, which I encourage everybody here to check out. The book forms the foundation of the presentation she's going to provide now. Karen, I'll hand it over to you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Matt. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hear you perfectly.
Excellent. So it is a treat for me to share with you tonight a piece of the story of my own personal transformation as a leader in business. Growing up and being trained from a traditional management perspective, didn't realize at the time how much I had to really learn. And so what I kind of took away when I started to prepare for this presentation and how to share kind of the key points of this story, I really pulled out a key phrase, and that is how lean thinking addressed huge demand fluctuation in a retail environment across thousands of stores. Clearly, I did not have responsibility for thousands of stores. I had a small pocket of stores out of New England. It was about 110 stores at the time. And what I was really learning about was how to close the gap between what the leader, me in this case, was thinking should be happening and how the frontline team members were actually performing the work. This gap in understanding that I had based off of past experience when I was originally trained. You see, I had started with Starbucks back in about 2002, and we were growing tremendously year over year for many years. And we couldn't do anything wrong, at least we thought so at the time, until 2008, when the economic crisis knocked on everyone's door. And like so many, my business that I was responsible for faltered and was really challenged when it came to the consistency of the customer's experience. I didn't realize it at the time, but there was capability that I didn't have. See, up to that point in time, I really relied on my business acumen and knowledge of all of the experience that I had had previously. So when I started to really think about and be faced with challenges within this demand fluctuation, this is what we were really looking at. You see, across the 110 stores in my portfolio, we could say was typical at the time, right? There could be 3 different stores, cafe stores, as you might know, across the street from each other or right up the block, or even just a couple of miles away. And the demand of the products from the customers coming up to the front cafe counter in the morning, from 6 in the morning until about 10:30 a.m., let's say we'll call that the morning rush, might look something like this. So there might be 3 people on in the cafe at 6 o'clock in the morning. And then all of a sudden the demand of the customers would increase and we would need 4 people at 6:30. And then that would jump up to needing 7 people at 7 o'clock. And less than 30 minutes later, you'd need 11 people. And you'd need 11 people potentially staffed in that cafe up until 9 o'clock in the morning. And then bam, it would dramatically drop. And then it would drop again. And this volume, right, demand that we had become used to, and I myself had become used to, what we didn't fully recognize at the time was this little thing in the corner here of 170,000 different combinations, which I think has been noted since 2020, the different types of beverages that were available for the customers to order, from the different types of coffee to the different types of milk and all the syrups and the additions that you can place into an espresso beverage. And the cafe up the street, during the same time frame, the demand might look like this. It might have been near a train station or a bus station in downtown, let's say New Haven, Connecticut, across the street from Yale, right? Where for a clear 30 minutes, they had a high peak in demand. And then all of a sudden, no one would be there. And then they'd have another peak, and then it would drop. And they would have another peak, and it would drop. And it would drop off as people got into work for the day. And yet there could be another variation of this demand. This could be somewhere in rural Connecticut, out in school somewhere, where actually the same period of time, the demand and the combinations needed to serve the customer properly were different than the other two. So as a leader of this business at that time, I was reliant on what I learned when I was first trained. I clearly understood the impact of the actual business results. See, I'd gotten really good at kind of measuring the success of the business, kind of from a lagging indicator perspective, from the profit and loss statement, as well as all of the other reports that were generated to help me measure the success of the business. And then when we learned to actually understand the demand fluctuation, we started to look at, and I learned how to actually see the stores work like this. We got into the detail of the work elements, the different cycle times for all the different production components inside of the cafe. I had the unique opportunity to be trained on how to understand this and actually calculate it. You see, at the time, Starbucks required the leaders to actually learn in detail in order to then train others. So I was responsible for learning this level of detail to then train my next leaders, my district managers. And they too then would learn this detail of work. They would understand and learn how to go observe that work. And they would then prepare to actually train their store managers. And then the cafe managers would learn the same level of detail of going to go see problems, understand this work in this way, to train actually their team members inside the cafes. It was this detail of work and understanding the components of work that for the first time as a traditional manager, I took a look at my business in a very different way. I recognized things I needed to learn that I didn't realize I actually needed to learn up until this point in time. You see, there was this divide that happened. As a business leader, I'm way over here on this left side, trying to struggle and figure out how to wrap my arms around this business that has significant demand fluctuation. The customer's experience was really inconsistent. Right? Up until this period of time, we had grown tremendously. And thankfully, Starbucks as an organization decided to take on a lean transformation. Josh and the others on the lean team helped us learn and understand actually how to look at the business very differently for the first time. We could see that, and I could see specifically in my area, that what I was thinking should be happening and what the baristas and others inside the cafe on the other side of this divide were actually doing and delivering for the customer were very different. We were clearly on different sides of the page. So I began to learn to see. And I selected this picture because I felt like I really was trying to learn how to see the forest through the trees and really understand the power of lean thinking at this time. I didn't realize it completely. I thought there was something interesting and something that I hadn't known before, but I really didn't understand how to unlock the power of it until the system started to come together. When I recognized for the first time that problems were hiding in plain sight, that actually inside of the demand fluctuation and understanding the key levers of the business, those details that existed inside the work components, was like the drive shaft. It enabled me to actually understand the performance of the organization I had responsibility for, how to impact the work that the team members were responsible for impacting, and how my decisions as a leader started to impact them and directly flowed straight through to the customer's experience. You see, I had been so addicted, just like my peers, to solving problems this old-fashioned way. We were really chained to desks. I don't know, maybe some of you also experienced the same thing, or were attached to phones making decisions, or stuck inside a conference call and just can't step out onto that front line and take the time needed to actually recognize and understand what was happening. You see, I couldn't see as a traditional business leader that the problems that kept me actually chained to the phone on those conference calls or in the meetings really actually resided inside the work. And if I could actually just pry myself away long enough and learn how to understand the work and see it in a very different way, if I could solve these actual problems through technically understanding the work and observing it very differently for the first time, I might be able to get off the phone, out of the meeting, and not have to join so many conference calls. I really needed to learn to see and observe the work, and through doing that, build my own personal capability as a leader of the business. I had to take responsibility to step out differently than I had done before. I had to take my ego and I had to park it on the shelf and really actually show up as a humble leader of the team, recognizing that I actually didn't know, I didn't have the answers. Lean thinking and practice gave me a way to start to discover and learn and stand shoulder to shoulder with those who were trying to do the work to understand how to find the answers to some of the most critical problems they were dealing with day in and day out. So I had to become a beginner. It is said too often, and it's really hard to do. It's really hard to take your experience of many years and put it to the side and actually show up to see something and learn something new for the very first time, and tremendously humbling. So I went to go see the work and understand it in this way. How to actually stand in one place. You know, in the retail industry, we had been raised on how to scan the environment really quickly and see as many things as you could and make some very quick assumptions and opinions about what you thought the problems were and how you thought they should solve for them. However, this called on us, and for me, to slow down, to actually stop and keep observing, to actually understand what was it about the work that was creating value. What was it about that work that was transformative? How could we talk about it in a similar way? How could we identify what was happening that was wasteful, that was taking the baristas away from being able to serve the customers well, and recognize that the work was getting in their way? We had not designed work for them that helped them be successful. So with that, there were many problems to solve. The organization was trying to solve brewed coffee problems. We were looking at the production of all the components within the cafe. And for me, my biggest aha moment came when I had this problem around the sausage breakfast sandwich. I've shared this story multiple different times, and it's a powerful one. You see, as a traditional leader, we had launched breakfast sandwiches across the US. And in the area, sausage breakfast sandwiches particularly were not performing well. You can see here the gap that I had to close. I had over $2 million worth of revenue and almost $1 million worth of profit gap to close, as the sausage savory breakfast sandwich was not selling like it was expected to. You know, that patty with fluffy eggs, aged cheese, cheddar, served perfectly on a toasted Thomas's English muffin with all the nooks and crannies. However, something was wrong and they weren't selling like they should have. I went about it my traditional management approach. I ordered more sandwiches, assumed that they didn't have enough to sell, pushed more down to the cafes and got more from the supply chain and pushed it into the stores. I thought if they had enough, they could sell more. Stack it high and watch them fly was what I had been raised on. Until one day, I recognized that I didn't really understand the work of the breakfast sandwich. And so I entered into one of the cafes and worked alongside of the baristas to actually understand what the work process was to prepare a breakfast sandwich for the next morning. You see, they were freshly made. and they were flash frozen and sent to the cafes in order to thaw for 24 hours before they were warmed in a nice toasted oven to serve to the customer that morning. However, what I learned and what I experienced was that the stacking of the sausage breakfast sandwiches, in order to prepare them properly for the next day, they needed to be laying flat on the shelf in a grated pan. And this allowed for the air to circulate. However, that's not what was happening. The baristas had been stacking them side by side really tightly, and the air wasn't able to circulate. So the more sandwiches that I pushed to the cafes as a business leader making decisions really removed from where the work was happening, recognized that I was actually part of the problem. I didn't understand the work. I didn't understand that they didn't know the work and how to handle the sandwiches properly. So that in the next morning, when they would take those sandwiches out to heat them for the customers, they were ordered, and they would hit the proper button to actually toast that sandwich. The customer would get a warm sandwich on the outside. However, the inside, the center, didn't meet quality expectations because it was still cold. It was the biggest aha moment that I had had in my total experience of how I really needed to recognize and understand the work differently. So from there, I took it upon understanding the details of this work. And when the sandwiches were actually set properly, laying out to get air circulation, and they were then thawed properly for the next morning, the baristas could do good work. The customer would come in, they would order the sausage breakfast sandwich, and they would ask to have that heated properly. They would hit the right button in the oven, and poof, the customer would receive a beautifully toasted, really hot in the middle sausage breakfast sandwich. The sales went up, and we closed the revenue gap. I had spent so much time prior to actually understanding the work, making decisions about the business without really understanding the work, and actually creating more challenges for the team members than I had ever intended. So it's a little story of the sausage breakfast sandwich, but it was lasting learning for me to recognize as a leader the impact of my decisions, and when I do actually understand the work and I don't. It takes the productivity of problem solving to a whole different level. So you see, as a business leader, I was responsible for this experience. I thought I knew this experience well. What I didn't recognize is that I really didn't know the work of this experience. And when I started to learn and practice lean thinking and understand the components of the work, I was able to actually better understand that through building my own capability as a leader and through practicing the thinking, I was actually then building the capability of my direct team members. And as I built their capability, they in turn built the capability of their team members until the entire organization that I had responsibility for had a common way of thinking, a common way of understanding problems, a common way of actually measuring success. As we developed standardized work for all the production work, it really led to understanding resource planning and demand planning as an operating system. As I shared with you in the beginning slides of every cafe could be different based off of their customer base, their product mix, and the demand on each one of those products was very different. We then had a systemic way to actually understand how to break down that work based off of the customer demands and how to staff for it. They had the tools and the operating system of work that they needed to really be successful. And as a leader, I then had the capability to actually make decisions that were in alignment with what I knew the team members could actually perform against. And the customer then benefited from that. It really led to the ability to balance the work and really manage those huge swings in demand. This informed the management system. They had a management system at the cafe level where problems would be gathered during the day. and they would be placed onto a board in the back room. And then the cafe manager was responsible for processing on those problems. So the team members or the baristas who were doing the work would be able to actually write down the problems that they were struggling with during the day inside of the work that was outside the standard, things that were like causing them to fall out of standard. They would have a way to actually capture those problems and put them in a common place so that they then as a team could start to circulate and solve for those problems at this cafe level. Anything that wasn't able to be solved at the cafe level would then go up to the district manager's level. At the district level system problems were recognized. And if they weren't able to get solved at that level, they would then also get escalated to then my level. And if I wasn't able to help support the solve of the problem, depending on what it was, I then had a way to actually get it to the next highest level and up into the system. So our management system linked all the way from the cafes all the way up through the executive leaders. And it was all because of this foundational understanding of actually how to do the work, the detail of that work, and then how does that work come together to develop a system to help us actually manage and solve problems. So you see, we kind of went from this. We went from leaders solving problems removed from the work. I was one of them. I was guilty as charged, stuck on the conference call in the meeting room, trying to make decisions to the best of my ability, thinking I'm serving my business and my team members well, to actually getting onto the front line of work, really deeply understanding the work, the problems in which impact that work, ensuring as a leader that there's a system in place to have improved work and problems are getting solved for and escalated and responded to quickly. I can't say that all the conference calls went away, but they certainly did change in nature. All of them became really focused on what are the current problems we're solving right now? How do we know that they're actually problems? What have we observed in those problems that help us understand actually the factual information about them? With that, I'd love to take any questions that might be out there or share some different actions.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that wonderful presentation. I'll ask the audience, as questions come to mind, please add them in the chat, or the comments, I should say, and we'll ask them. I'll get started maybe with the question that's on everybody's mind. When you go to Starbucks and you order a plain hot coffee, why does that sometimes go to the barista and you have to get in the queue? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. I'm struck by something that you said, Karen. It was so similar to something that Roberto Ranzani said during his presentation about Dan-Totsu quality and Mr. Nomura's method of quality improvement. He said, problems aren't solved in conference rooms, and you said problems aren't solved on conference calls. Almost identical statements there. Why was that a challenge for you to learn, or why do you think that's a challenge for leaders in general to learn?
That's a great question, Matt. I now, within my role at LEI, am fortunate enough to work across different businesses and across different industries. And I see it as a systemic issue. So it's not unique to retail, I don't think, in any way. I think the demands of the day of the business are so great. And the attention of the leader who's responsible for that business is really getting pulled in so many different directions that without a common way to actually prioritize the information that's coming at you, recognize what your role is in relationship to delivering on the value for the organization, it's too easy to just stay caught up in that swirl. Once we started getting introduced to lean thinking in practice, it started to pull us in a way that we're like, wow, we actually have a different way of thinking about this now. So why do we continue to fall back on our old behavior or get pulled in, in directions that we used to do? And so you start to get really uncomfortable and start to be able to see, it's like looking in the mirror when those old behaviors start to show up. And it took time. I can stand here today and talk about it as if it was an easy thing to do, but it wasn't at all easy, and it took time. And the more of us that actually practice, we had more peer level support for each other to actually hold ourselves able or hold ourselves accountable to actually stopping for a minute and thinking about what facts do we really have at our disposal right now that are helping us actually understand this problem we're trying to simply solve off the cuff in this urgent way because it feels very urgent right now on the phone. So
it's hard to find facts on
it's really
a
hard to
phone
find
call,
facts.
right?
It is.
We have a question here from Peter Watkins, and Starbucks, it's a huge organization, tens of thousands of stores. And it's a question about how do you develop team members' scientific problem-solving capability, and how do you scale that capability in an organization as large and really decentralized as Starbucks?
Oh, that's a big question too. So I can represent it from when I was with the organization. I don't know how closely that relates to what they're trying to work through right now. But when I was still in position with Starbucks at the time, having a method of problem solving, meaning as the work was improved and standards were developed, so there's a standard routine way to look at the work, and there were standard routines to do the work. That allowed us to look at situations in a similar way. So we might go do an observation and be able to see it the same way versus seeing it very differently. It helped cut through our opinions. That standardization then helped us actually have facts and develop facts about problems that were showing up if the work wasn't being done to standard. That in and of itself creates measures and a way to actually drive kind of that scientific thinking and or a common problem solving method. Everyone was trained on that. We used a 4-step learning method, and then there was actually a coaching kata that was developed as well for us as leaders, so that we actually learned a common way to actually not only train through a job instruction, but also then how do we follow up on how we're performing, whether we're on standard or off standard. So that was our approach. It was up to us as leaders to maintain a rigor and discipline to keeping that in place. Clearly, the management system, when it didn't exist, it would fall apart. And we needed to kind of go back at it as it wasn't completely perfect. We weren't perfect at doing that.
Sounds similar to a comment that I think Josh Howell made during the Two Nigels discussion around scaling a solution versus scaling a method of developing problem-solving capability and creating new solutions.
Yes.
We have a lot of questions coming in. This one comes from Kim, and Kim asks, Karen, as a top leader, what do you think is the most important lean principle for your personal lean transformation loop? How you influence your superior boss to be a lean thinker also? So how do you influence other leaders for your boss?
That's another really great question. I have likely become overly passionate about trying to really actually understand the work. And because I had my own personal strong experience with that, it tends to be where I'll lean. So I will find myself often asking myself, do I actually understand what the work is of this problem right now, and questioning it, and or actually asking other leaders, whether they're senior leaders or others at the time within Starbucks, do we actually understand what the work of this problem is right now? And using that literally as a guiding question. Far too frequently, people got tired of me probably asking that question.
So a really good question here from Jim Glover. Karen, you talked a lot about looking inwardly, your own reflection process, changing your behavior. So many of us look externally for reasons why problems exist without looking inside ourselves for how we may be contributing to the problem. So Jim is asking, self-awareness is how you may be perceived as a leader. That's a rare thing. What drove you to look inwardly?
Well, I the moment I first stepped on the line, when we were asked to actually understand and learn how to steam milk again for the first time, I thought that I knew it. So stepping behind the espresso bar and literally having to learn how to steam the milk, so do the work of the frontline team members with them all watching, was an incredibly humbling experience and rewarding. And so it was a rewarding experience side of that I guess continued to reinforce that same behavior. So they were so open and engaged by the fact that I recognize I don't know what I'm doing, and that I need you to kind of go gentle with me. That started to build a relationship and an attachment to, actually, the more humble you can become, I don't need to have the answers. If I can get really great at actually asking pretty powerful questions, as hard as they might be sometimes, or strong questions, that's a better position to be in than trying to fake any answers that I could come up with.
Making yourself vulnerable and trying something, in this case, making a beverage where you knew you wouldn't be able to do it successfully the first time, and just demonstrating keen interest in the actual work. It kind of leads me to my next question. Rich Vellante, way back, 8 hours ago, he talked about the restaurant environment and the challenges the average line cook faces. He used the words trying to survive a night on the line. And he thinks that has a tie to what's happening now with a so-called Great Resignation, where people are leaving jobs in droves. And, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what you think may be at the heart of the Great Resignation, in this case, across the retail sector. In fact, I went to 3 Starbucks last Sunday. They were all closed at 4 p.m. All had a sign on the door that said, "Sorry, we don't have workers, so we're closing early." So what are your thoughts on what may be at the heart of this?
I hear you. I really truly believe in my heart that it has to do with this gap between what leaders think should be happening and what is actually happening on the front line. And I believe that the experience on the front line has been so tremendously challenging, and the leaders, though I don't want to say they've been blind to it, but they haven't fully understood and grasped it. And so because that gap exists, and it has existed, I experienced it myself. It was magnified during this pandemic in a way that moved more faster than we could adjust to. And so the frontline team members across industries have realized and recognized pretty quickly different things that they would like to do, or their different approach to how they'd like to progress in their lives. And leaders are still trying to catch up because of this gap. I couldn't urge leaders enough to please get onto the front lines of your organization and really listen to what's going on and understand the facts of that situation before jumping to conclusions as to why you're challenged in getting staffed, being staffed. How difficult is it to do the work? What are you asking for your people? Yeah.
We have a question here from our friend Oriol, who I think he's still awake. He must be maybe poolside in Tenerife,
probably
now with maybe his 3rd or 4th mojito. And Oriol asks, you mentioned, Karen, the changes and proposals you discussed with the team were easy or common sense. What was the reaction, or how was this seen by team members in the cafes?
How were the changes seen by the team members? So I would say we had varying reactions. So part of the approach to understanding the current situation at the time was to go see along with the baristas. There were many baristas that were excited that we finally started to recognize the challenges that they were facing and dealing, and that we didn't actually understand the way that they did. There were baristas that they weren't very happy with us. And number one, they might have been frustrated because we hadn't been there before. Or they didn't necessarily believe in what we were trying to actually do. So it ran the spectrum of reaction for the baristas. What I can say is that our approach was to try and understand it as closely as we could alongside of them, ensure that their input and their voice was heard along the process, so that they could feel part of the solutions that were developed for each and every cafe, knowing that the demand was different in every cafe and the product mix was different in each cafe, and that they were part of that unique difference, and that improving the work in this way was really intended to better enable their creativity and expertise to kind of come to the plate and be leveraged, versus getting mired and tangled up in all of the snarls of not having good work to do because the work was so challenging and there were so many problems inside the work. That was our intention, but the barista's reaction ran the gamut from supportive to not supportive.
Well, a related question. With certain reactions comes, the related probability of how changes will actually sustain. And here we have a question of what were some methods that you used to sustain the changes that you deployed?
So primarily it was around having a management system in place. We found pretty quickly that if we didn't pay attention and it didn't become how we operated versus being something new or off to the side of what the normal operation was, it needed to become how we operated. And having a discipline and a rigor to that on a daily basis was really required. When that would fall away, or we might get distracted, let's say, by a new promotion that might be happening or something, we had to remind ourselves that we were still early on in the journey and it needed our attention, and to speak to it consistently, openly, and specifically, time and time again. As new team members joined the team, they would be trained in problem solving in this method. We would consistently make sure that we went through the learning methods and would revisit the management system of problem solving from the cafe all the way up. But it took a conscious effort to ensure sustainability over time. And the more team members that came on, I won't say it became easy to sustain. However, it became more obvious to sustain because now it became more of the norm versus the exception.
I'm going to transition to maybe a more technical question. You put up a pretty shocking number on one of your slides. There are, I think it said 170,000 different beverage combinations at Starbucks. It makes me think I'm not trying hard enough when I place my order. But a retail environment, especially something like a cafe where there's not a level demand, customers come when they come, probably early in the morning for breakfast, maybe right after lunch, not exactly sure. And there's that huge variety of what could potentially hit a barista. And in that sort of volatile, uncertain environment, how do you create something like standardized work for a barista? How do you create a repeatable routine in that environment?
Yeah, great question. So there were certain work standards, let's say temperatures and or holding times, that would ensure the safety and the quality from a brand perspective, that were embedded inside of the actual work routines. But the approach that was used was to observe the work of, let's say, making an espresso beverage and recognizing and understanding what about the steps to doing that work were fixed, meaning every espresso beverage has espresso. It may have milk of some sort. And the things that were different about it, whether that was the types of milk and or types of syrups or additions to that beverage, then were able to be flexible in nature. So there was a routine that was actually developed to help us actually understand how do you maintain the base standard work, and then how do you include all of the different combinations that might happen. Meaning, you do milk every time. It might be a different type of milk, but you do milk each time, and that's part of a standard routine. There's inclusions that are added to a beverage each time, so you account for the actual activity of doing that. So standardizing the routine approach to actually building a beverage, what was the actual addition or variation of that addition is what would be flexible. So
thanks, Karen.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask about, retail is an environment that we as, we can go see in operation just as customers. It's not something like a car factory. I can't just walk into a Ford plant. I can't walk into a Toyota plant, but I can walk into a Starbucks. I can walk into a CVS, and I can observe an operation. And I'm curious, and somewhat related, I think, to our next speaker, but is there a model environment, a retail environment, an organization that you admire, and what is it about them that you admire from how they perform?
Yeah, I'll speak to. I admire a lot about Starbucks. I continue to this day, but additionally, Stu Leonard's comes to mind, and I know Sarah will be sharing it in a little bit here. But from a tenet of actually understanding the simplification, so providing your customers and your employees a simple environment to focus in on and become better at than anyone else can, really rings true to me today, differently than it has in the past. Meaning, how can we simplify things? It's far too easy to complicate it, and so it takes great skill and restraint and expertise to actually be more simple than complex. Things in and of themselves are complex enough already and really challenging. So how can we simplify, make it easy for customers to make decisions, make it easy for team members to be successful in their work, and make it easy for leaders to be successful in leading those two things together?
And I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Actually, maybe just one. Here from Raphael. He asks, one of the most interesting things about the implementation of lean thinking is that to the extent that workers understand the principles, the work is much easier. But many times it is difficult to reach all the people in an organization. So what is the easiest way to reach as many people as possible?
I guess in my opinion, what I would share would be taking the time to think through that every person does matter, and every person has a leader manager. And so how do we get to the different layers of leaders and managers to ensure that they get to each one of their team members in a really present, authentic, and engaging way? I feel really fortunate to have had the experience I was enabled to have at Starbucks, and in that way, in which it became really clear to me who my direct customer was, and that was my direct team district manager. And if I focused in on that, and then expected and enabled them to focus in on their next their customer, which is the cafe manager, we could actually get to every single person. We could get to every barista and every person and ensure that they knew, understood, and recognized their importance to the entire equation to deliver for customers. So
thank you so much, Karen. And we'll see you in just a few minutes back with our next speaker during her Q&A. So we'll see you in about 45 minutes or so. Thank you so much, Karen.
Great. Thanks, Matt.